Hello, my name is Lindokuhle Khumalo. I'm an associate lecturer with the Department of Geography, Environmental Studies and Tourism at the University of the Western Cape. I am also affiliated with the University of Oslo, where I am a PhD candidate. It's a great pleasure to be part of the Conservation Symposium 2023. The title of my presentation is Game On, Understanding South Africa's Emerging Game Meat Value Chain. Let me give an overview of my talk. So this presentation is based on research that I conducted together with three colleagues of mine, Melanie Somerville, Tyro Kamuti, and Shelley Brooks. The research was conducted through a fellowship funded by a US-based NGO called the Tiny Beam Fund. And in the year 2021, we published our findings in a guidance memo, basically a more comprehensive policy brief. And there we traced efforts to formalize and expand the production of game meat in the wildlife ranching sector in South Africa. So all four of us are social scientists, human geographers to be specific. So we come from that perspective, a critical social science perspective, and I think that is our contribution here is that of from a social science perspective. My presentation is in three sections. I will start off by giving a brief history of the game sector. I will then move on to look at the growth and change in the game sector. Then I'll wrap things up by exploring some of the challenges that we've identified in the game meat value chain. I will run through a history of the game sector. So the 1960s really are the period where we see efforts towards formalization. And of course, before 1960, there was a very clear distinction between wildlife and livestock. And hunting privileges for wildlife were awarded by the state. But by 1960, we see provincial conservation authorities, some provincial conservation agencies encouraging farmers to keep game animals on their land, and even supplying farmers with game animals. So interested farmers could be supplied with game animals from the 1960s. By 1991, this is the time when the Game Theft Act was passed, and it made it possible for farmers to now own wildlife, provided that they've erected suitable fencing. This is also in the midst of the transition period for South Africa. Also just 3 years before our first democratic elections, also a period where economic sanctions were lifted, making it possible for international tourists to come into the country to view or hunt game animals. So that also provided new economic opportunities, right? Now, a main driver of expanded game production was also the conversion of cattle and other farms to game farms and private game reserves. And of course, there were also other reasons behind that. Now, one challenge that we faced in undertaking this research was there is a scarcity of data on the industry. But data suggests that there is about 13,000 game operations in South Africa. So that's about 20% of South Africa's land base. 2015 saw the launch of the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy by the Department of Environmental Affairs, now known as the DFFE. I will talk more about the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy in this as we go along. Having looked at the history of the sector, I want to shift our focus to the processes giving new momentum to longer running efforts to expand and formalize the game meat value chain. Now, by the early 2000s, game production in South Africa was still new, but at the same time, it was an increasingly established industry with animals mainly produced under extensive conditions on larger farms and larger reserves. But the last 15 years have seen both the expansion and, in some cases, in some operations, the intensification of game production. And what is probably the most significant change in South Africa's game sector in the recent decades is the emergence of what industry representatives term as intensive and selective breeding. Now, this type of breeding refers to deliberate selection and breeding for specific animal traits, usually under controlled conditions. Intensive and selective breeding is applied to high-value species such as buffalo to produce desirable features, for example, to maximize the animal's body size or the horn spread. It is also used to accelerate the production of what is known as color morphs. As shown on the graph, intensive and selective breeding has contributed to a remarkable price increase. However, it is also associated with the collapse in game prices. This type of breeding has received legislative backing through the Animal Improvement Act of 2019, which essentially gave permission to improve wildlife animals, or what was previously classified as wildlife animals and is now reclassified as farm animals. So it basically gave permission to improve those animals, at least 32 of these formerly wildlife species. The spectacular returns associated with game production from the mid-2000s attracted both existing farmers who were looking to diversify their operations, but also outside investors without prior experience in farming. And this has involved some high-profile personalities, with the most famous among them being South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa. It remains unclear what the collapse in game prices has meant for these new investors and new entrants into the game sector. However, some sources suggest that the industry is seeing some consolidation. In addition, we've seen yet another sort of capital entering the wildlife industry, this time from the major international funders associated with biodiversity finance, such as the World Bank and the WWF. Hunting norms and practices have also seen some important changes. Recent years have seen some heated debates around the ethics of trophy hunting, as well as the keeping and killing of animals in captivity globally. And South Africa's captive lion sector has come under particular scrutiny for carpeting and canned hunting operations. However, following its receipt of the high-level panel of experts report in early 2021, the DFFE has suggested that governments will put captive practices for lions to an end. However, it remains unclear what will happen to the properties, whether they will fade away or if they will be converted to other commercial wildlife users. Alongside the expansion of private farms, recent years have seen the emergence of community game farms involving portions of South Africa's black majority. These community game farms are created through one of two main mechanisms, the first being the country's land reform program, and the second being the biodiversity stewardship planning in communal areas. While the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy sees the wildlife sector as holding or having major transformative potential, it recognizes that there's still a long way to go. the DFFE itself has noted that the low levels of transformation in the industry are the sector's or remain the sector's biggest challenge. The last four processes I've mentioned indicate that game production has undergone rapid change in the last 2 decades. But just the last few years, a series of crises have brought the sector nearly to a halt. The 2007-2008 financial crisis, which was followed by the drought in 2015 and the 2016 collapse in game prices. Most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic, which led the former CEO of the WRSA to comment that the sector was on the brink of collapse. And of course, the pandemic had various negative impacts, including loss of employment. The challenging circumstances facing game operators today constitute something of a watershed moment for the country's wildlife industry. Many participants are reflecting deeply on the industry's future and are actively exploring ways to make their operations more resilient. This has drawn attention and supporters to the idea of formalizing and expanding the game meat value chain. And of course, this is driven by both environmental and economic concerns. Formalization of the value chain is also promoted in the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy. And in 2022, the DFFE tabled the draft game meat strategy for public comment, and this was approved in its revised form in September last year. So this brings me to the last part of my talk. And as critical scholars, we've done what critical scholars are known for, which is, among other things, to identify potential dangers associated with particular trends. But I must emphasize that our policy brief or our game memo does outline a number of recommendations that could be implemented to mitigate these challenges. The challenges we've identified are in 3 sets. The first being socioeconomic issues, secondly, environmental challenges, and lastly, human health and animal welfare. I will start with socioeconomic and transformation challenges. Now, the wildlife sector has emerged as a critical industry in rural South Africa, especially noting that the industry provides thousands of jobs. The DFFE itself has suggested that the number of people employed in this sector could climb to 100,000 jobs by the year 2030. The main concern, however, is that the industry remains white dominated even after 25 years of democracy. Now, this is a cause for concern, especially noting the entrenched poverty experienced by South Africa's black majority. There's also issues around the establishment of private game farms and reserves, which often involve the displacement of farm workers. In many cases, once farms have been converted, the labor of farm workers is no longer necessary and farm workers are relocated. And of course, this has detrimental impacts on their livelihoods. As far as community game farms are concerned, there's lack of post-settlement support. Community benefits are also often unclear within these types of arrangements. And despite there being DFFE targets in the Biodiversity Economy Lab, the state and industry still has a long way to go. So there's questions around where should black ownership be focused in both the broader wildlife sector and the game meat value chain. With regards to environmental sustainability, it is important to note that the allocation of ownership rights over wildlife has resulted in at least a tenfold increase in wildlife numbers in the country. So there is a significant contribution being made to biodiversity conservation here. However, there are issues around intensified game production, which often occurs in small camps, leading to environmental problems. There's also intensive breeding practices, which may introduce invasive and extralimittal species into areas beyond their natural ranges. Also concerns around land use change and carrying capacity. Proliferation of game farms can also alter game population dynamics and predator control. There's also some concerns around potential of reputational risk to broader wildlife sector in the country. Lastly, we look at health and welfare concerns. Consumers and regulatory bodies are placing increased pressure on producers to provide meat, and this includes game meat in a safe and ethical manner. Now, compliance will require a focus on disease, food safety, and animal welfare at various points of the supply chain. But there are still issues also around the game meat regulations, which are yet to be finalized under the Meat Safety Act. While many consider game meat to be superior to other protein sources, there's concerns around the limited inspection capacity and the reality that a sizable proportion of game meat enters the domestic market uninspected. Intensifying game production at some operations can lead to animal confinement, overstocking, underfeeding, and unsafe transport conditions. I want to close by highlighting that whether the emerging game meat value chain develops in a conservation-friendly or conservation-enhancing direction remains an open question. Appropriate regulation is critical, especially considering that there seems to be a significant economic and employment opportunities in the game meat sector. Some actors seem to already be positioning themselves to take advantage of opportunities, for example, through the establishment of species societies following the amendment of the Animal Improvement Act of 2019. To some extent, this will require working against both long-running and recent trends in the broader wildlife sector, as highlighted by this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lindokuhle Khumalo, for the presentation, sharing with us the emerging trends in the value chains in the game meat in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, I will invite with me here Lindokuhle to join us for the Q&A. I would also like to invite Dr. Mareta to also unmute so that we can have a discussion. So now we can post our questions online. We can also raise our hands and then we'll note you and then we can have a discussion. I have a lot of questions to ask Dr. Mareth and Lindokuhle, but maybe to start with those that are coming from the audience. There is one here that has been posted. It says it's directed to both of you, so one of you or all can respond to it. Breeding of captive lions in South Africa has been a point of concern in regards to animal welfare and ethical conservation practices. What is your take on these concerns, and how can the captive facilities address the issues of concern as part of promoting sustainable wildlife conservation? Yeah, it speaks to the breeding of lions. Perhaps attached to that question as well, you can as well respond to both. Is this appetite to get involved in the wild meat sector, is it not going to push us into the direction of breeding more animals and converting them, or getting involved in the practices that are there in the livestock sector? Over to you, either Mareth or Lindokuhle, you can respond.
Good morning, Chairperson. If it's in order, I will start. It is a very well-known fact that the moment there's food security involved, the reality is that obviously production will need to be the priority in terms of to provide for that need or that demand. And currently in South Africa, we've got a problem that we import a lot of our daily need for animal protein. So obviously, this is something that I want to steer away from, but it's realistic to think that going forward, let's say Plains Game will have to provide or supplement at least in terms of our red meat demand in South Africa. So going forward, yes, we're in a country, a semi-arid and ideal for game farming, but I'm quite sure that when we look at what the demand in South Africa is and the increasing population, that we'll have to look at other venues to have a proper, and can I add, a nutritional and wholesome animal protein food source available for at least our own people in South Africa. The reality is in the EU and many other countries, they already looking at this fantastic protein food source that we have available in South Africa. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Lindokuhle. You want to comment on that?
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So our research did not look specifically into captive lions. However, what I can say is that it's important for the game meat sector to take this issue seriously, as it can compromise, and I think it does compromise the integrity of the country's wildlife heritage as well as the wildlife economy. So it's an important matter. It's an activity that the sector will need to take seriously, because it can tarnish the brand South Africa, but also the wildlife heritage of the country.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there anyone on the floor who wants to raise a question? I'm not seeing any hand there. Am I seeing? Okay. Anyone who wants to comment on that? I'm not seeing a hand. Okay, so Dr. Mareth, you talk much about that there must be an increase of on the farm, or should I say rural abattoirs in South Africa, in the protected areas and in the ranges. How is that possible, given that there are also concerns for conservation in terms of extinction of these wild animals? Are you perhaps suggesting that there is a potential to meet the demand, or are we not going to run into a situation where it will cause the extinction of these precious wild meat species? Over to you.
Thank you, Chief. Let me see. I'm not muted.
Yes.
You're
muted. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So if I take you back to the production in terms of what is the number of game animals available in South Africa, I will never say that we can solely provide for the meat demand, but surely the game industry can supplement at least the demand in South Africa. The reality is in terms of going forward, there is already a lot of game meat available on our local commercial market, and being in the food sector, or being in the receiving part of all the meat coming onto the market, I can tell you that a lot of our processed products already contain a lot of game meat. Game meat has been discovered. It's utilized very widely. We also nowadays find an interested sector in terms of traditional slaughtering, and that is for religious and cultural purposes, that game meat is getting very popular in that regard as well. So I think in terms of, we have a lot of game animals available. I think if you compare in terms of domesticated animals, which is between 14 and I think it was 16 million heads, the game animals is 21 and exceeding. So obviously we do have a lot of game meat available. South Africa is the ideal country to breed game animals. And I think during the color period, we saw this happening in an escalated manner. So I do think that although we already utilize game meat in the local market, I think with the correct legal guideline, it will increase, and it will also make sure that we pay the proper price that we are supposed to pay, and not give, let's say, the entrepreneur a very cheap product, and then later on the consumer must pay the full price of what this product is worth. And obviously, I didn't expand on the health benefits, but that's been researched over and over. We know per gram game meat is much more nutritional than any of our other animal protein food sources. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mareth. On that note, Lindokuhle, I see that in your policy brief or in your policy issue on the emerging wild meat value chains in South Africa, you also looked into the extensive farming and also intensive farming. So will you perhaps comment on that? Will you say majority of the game meat is now coming from the intensive breeding, or is coming from the extensive breeding?
Thank you for that question. Well, I do not have this is the point that we try to make in our research also, that there's a paucity of data as far as the game industry is concerned, and so I do not have the numbers as to what is the scale looking like. However, there are issues around a lot of game farms being of a small size, and of course the issue of capacity. The fact that the animals are fenced in, and that obviously has an impact on animal dynamics, predator balance, and all of that. So there is an issue, but I can't really speak to whether is it extensive or intensive mostly. But yes, over the years we have seen more extensive forms of game meat production.
Okay. Thank you very much. There is a question here on the chat box. In the process of meat inspection and inspection report, what are the essential microbiological safety, security, and regulatory parameters are being considered for purpose of community health and public health safety, so as to ensure that the output meat is totally hygiene and safe to consume? I think this is directed to you, Dr. Mareth, but also Lindokuhle, you can respond to it.
So, okay, so in terms of a bacteriological count, remember there's a difference between a carcass, the surface count, as well as in a processed product. The moment we start with secondary processing, the legal guideline allows us a 10 to the power 4 bacteriological load, which still means that it's safe for human consumption. So there was an incident during the Listeria outbreak that South Africa discovered we don't have a proper standard for bacteriological organisms on fresh meat. So there was a lot of research and task teams done to make sure that we have a standard in terms of to ensure that we have a compliant product when we move to the consumer's plate. But now you must remember one thing: people's palate differ. So one people will have one group of people will prefer well done, and the others blue or rare, or not as overdone as when we look at well done and cuts like that. And that makes a difference in terms of what is the ultimate or the end user's bacteriological load on the product. Now, when we look at game meat, it provides for it's got a natural low pH, meaning that a lot of our pathogens, and I'm referring to bacteria, don't survive. We don't see the typical bell curve in terms of bacterial growth on game meat. which is actually ideal when you look at shelf life and the safety for consumers. But in terms of fresh meat, obviously we've done a lot of research, and the product provides for, in terms of the cold chain, storage facilities, storage temperatures, but it provides for bacteriological load, because the moment you take the skin off or you dress the carcass, then the contact and the cross-contamination happens with the environment, with human hands, with the equipment that's utilized in the process, which obviously will then add bacteriological contamination or load to the specific meat product or the cut.
Thank you, Dr. Mareth. Lindokuhle, you want to comment on that, or we can move to the next question?
Just briefly, I would say yes. Just to add to Martha, yes, I think there is definitely a need to ensure adequate, game meat inspection. There's definitely a need for that, especially noting the food scares that we've seen recently, the concerns around that, and the potential linkages between wild foods and diseases, and so there's definitely a need for increased capacity with regards to inspection. And of course, this also goes back to the game meat regulations. Also, I think there should be more towards training programs in this regard.
Thank you. I see Andrew Taylor here is also responding as an addition to the query earlier on of saying, can we send these wild meat species into extinction if we consumed more? Then he responds here that in any case, a private or a game ranger will certainly protect those species. That is, if he has got private interest. So I wanted to link this with the change in the South African legislation in the 1960s, when people were now started to be allowed to own animals or to control animals and invest their own interest. Then that's when you start to see an increase in the number of wild meat species in the game reserves, particularly in the private reserves. And even up to today, majority of the meat is coming from the private game reserves as compared to the publicly owned. So I'm just adding to the comment there that was made by Taylor on the comment box. So there's a question here. Meat production from farming to processing will be seeing more indigenous knowledge being used. I'm trying to get what the question is. Meat production from farming to processing will be seeing more indigenous knowledge being used. Perhaps here the question could be trying to seek out or to pull out the research question of asking us, how are we incorporating indigenous knowledge systems into these wild meat value chains, or into the management, governance, or use of these indigenous genetic resources from the bush? Do you want to comment on that? What has been your experience? Do you think the indigenous knowledge systems are being incorporated, maybe the old practices, the old way of preserving animals, the old way of cooking, and so forth? Any comment on that?
Chairperson, absolutely. You know what? A lot of the knowledge on the game farms was actually from the older farm workers that could tell you a lot of not only the disease profile of the animals on the farm, but also what manifested in terms of some of them dying, some of them having diseases. So that the inherited knowledge or the traditional knowledge, very, very important. And if I can give you a good example, the 10-10 principle that we use in the game meat industry, referring to not taking a game carcass temperature below 10 before 10 hours has lapsed. That is to provide for enzymic action, also to make sure that you have a more pH balanced, lower levels of tough meat. So there's specific information or knowledge from the inherited or the traditional knowledge that really helped us in terms of the game industry. Remember, it's not a red meat carcass. There's a lower percentage, a much lower percentage of fat. There is different pH values in terms of game meat. Even the male and female, the season, the morning or the afternoon hunting process, all of it plays a role. So yes, that information absolutely very valuable.
Thank you very much. I see there is also another question here. This one maybe can come to you also, Doc, and also Lindokuhle. It says, thank you, Doc, presenters from Uganda. Educate me on possible disease in case. The question is not complete, but I think, on food, it's a new question. Okay, so thank you, Doc, presenters from Uganda. Educate me on the possible disease in case. So here, I think the person is inquiring about the potential diseases in the wild animals. Perhaps we can comment, or you can comment based on the transfer of diseases from both animals, from livestock to the wild animals, or from the wild animals to the livestock. Perhaps you can comment on that, and even also to humans, the potential for zoonotic diseases, or like we saw with COVID. Are we not setting ourselves for another pandemic or endemic? Over to you, colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairperson. It's very important to know that when we still had bigger game farms, the zoonotic diseases or the disease profile in game meat was very, very low. But it has changed in the last decade and a half, to the extent that the game farms are getting smaller and smaller, and we do the presentation. We see the originally red meat focused diseases getting into game animals as well. So the inspection procedure, that is a global procedure. I must make it very clear that it's not something just for South Africa. So game meat inspection is a procedure that is a global requirement, still stays very important. Having said that, in terms of game meat, because it's got a very low pH, it naturally has less ability to sustain bacteriological growth. And we do see a lot of the diseases, and I would like the person that posed the question to me, maybe contact me afterwards, because I'll send a list of all the diseases that we've encountered in terms of game meat, and that is very important to note when you do meat inspection on game carcasses. But I want to make it also very clear that over the research that was done from 2008 up to 2012, that the disease profile in game carcasses was very low. Now, it's possible that all the sick animals are sorted out in nature, and you don't necessarily see them on the slaughter floor. But it's also true that we basically had partially condemnation and full condemnation of carcasses based on poor shot placements, based on bruising, and not necessarily on the diseases that was identified. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maretta. Lindokuhle, please tell us, what are the main drivers in the consumer sector, the drivers for consumption? I see that the wild meat is moving mainly into high-end or high-income communities, but also in the rural communities, it gets there, but mainly through poaching or illegal activities. So what are the drivers that causes these illegal activities? Is it the case here in South Africa? If you observe the rest of the African continent, there's more research around illegal hunting. In South Africa, is it a big thing? And how can we then perhaps look into the pathways to arrest that space, or to manage illegal hunting activities? Do you think building these value chains could be an opportunity to deal with some of these illegal practices? Both comments are welcome, but first over to you, Lindokuhle.
Yeah, I mean, as regards to value chain, I think that's an important question. You know, because a game meat is you know, being presented in two ways, primarily. One as a premium product, right? And also as a means to address the food insecurity in the country. Okay, and I think, you know, the illegal hunting that you see is linked to the food insecurity. However, what we have highlighted in our policy brief is that, you know, a premium product is going to attract premium prices, and this may be in conflict with this idea that game meat will also contribute towards lowering food insecurity. So what we've advised is that there be two different approaches in terms of marketing. That you could have branding that focuses on game meat or venison as being a premium product, but also have other options that will, you know, allow people who are low income to also be able to consume game meat, to buy game meat. So, for example, you could sell, you know, different cuts to different consumer groupings, and so on. So I think that is one way in which you can deal with that issue.
Okay, thanks, Lindokuhle. Doc, you want to have a comment on that?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think it's very important to note that in terms of game meat, there is a lack of a legal guideline in terms of a regulation. There's a draft regulation that was developed over many years and that I'm very comfortable with. But the reality is that game meat currently is in terms of the supply chain, the first, let's say, the first level in terms of the first receiver of the game meat gets it at a very cheap price, and then the end consumer pays a very high price for a very a good product. But the reality is that we need to get to a point where game meat is provided more, or the availability is improved in terms of to make it available to more communities, even poorer people. And that's why I presented to say that we've got to have more game abattoirs on farms. If you look at the ideal to transport to formal abattoirs, and the expenses related to that, as well as how clear is your inspection picture. And remember, 80% of your inspection lies in the red offal. So the moment it's dried out and old, you don't see some of the conditions. I think it's very important that we build out, or that we provide for this fantastic protein product that we've got in South Africa, to build it out and to really make it available to poorer communities, and to really up the nutritional value of the food we consume. I think everyone on this platform knows of the many children that has died in terms of the food that they consume, which is really a lot of crap. It's fake food. And we're sitting with such a wonderful product in South Africa, and our children are eating what? Preservatives. Thank you, Chair. Yes. Sorry, I'm being a bit emotional, but for me, it's very important that we utilize the good food that we have, and we're currently not doing it.
Yes, thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you very much, Dr. Mareth and Lindokuhle, for this chat and also for the presentation. I also like to say thank you all to the attendees online. Thank you for joining us. We have come to the end of this first workshop on our special session at the Conservation Symposium. So we will be continuing with our second workshop at 11:30. For now, thank you very much. But I would like to indicate to you that all the questions that you might have, feel free to send them through to us. We'll be also able to link you with the presenters or the speakers to respond to your questions. Thank you very much, Mareth, and thank you very much, Lindokuhle.